Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, the Anti-Semitic Assault on Basic Principles. Completed shortly before Hamas carried out its barbaric October massacre, Hate Speech and Academic Freedom takes up issues that have consequently gained new urgency in the academy worldwide. It is the first book to ask what impact anti-Semitism has had on the fundamental principles the academy relies on for its identity: academic freedom, free speech rights, standards for hiring or firing faculty members and administrators, and the ethics of academic conduct and debate. Anti-Semitic hatred is spreading at a fever pitch. What steps can counter it? What damage to students is done when departments embrace anti-Zionism? Should faculty members face consequences for promoting anti-Semitism on social media? Should universities make a new push to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism? Cary Nelson is the author or editor of 36 books, including 6 about anti-Semitism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has also published 400 essays. He is Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an affiliated faculty member at the University of Haifa. He holds an honorary doctorate from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He was national president of the American Association of University Professors from 2006 to 2012 and presently serves as chair of the Alliance for Academic Freedom. He is also an LCSCA Research Fellow.
You're very welcome to this event put on by the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. My name is David Hirsch. I am the Academic Director of the London Centre. We have quite regular seminars and many other activities that we do. I can tell you that we are going to publish a call for papers very soon for a major conference in London in April 2025. So please pencil in the date. I'll give you the precise date that we are working on in a second. Let me introduce to you Cary Nelson. Cary is one of the true intellectuals and the true scholars who is working today on the area of contemporary anti-Semitism. When I first knew Cary, it was about 20 years ago, and he was the president nationally of the American Association of University Professors, which at that time had a very straightforward academic freedom and freedom of speech position on the issue of boycotting Israel. It was against it. And Cary was the president when that position came under quite severe attack. And I think that in the best possible way, Cary will put me right if he doesn't see it this way. But I think that attack by the people who wanted to boycott Israeli academia somewhat radicalized him. And like many of us, the experience of fighting and resisting the boycott campaign was in some sense a life-changing experience, I think. Cary Nelson is the Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And he is also a Research Fellow of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Cary, you're so welcome. Cary's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions and discussion. Cary, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, David, and the London Centre for making it possible for this presentation to take place and to give me a good crowd of people to have a conversation with afterwards. You're right that the academic boycott is what energized me to deal with efforts to delegitimate Israel. The first boycott activism that I was engaged in was in the 2006 to 2007 academic year. Before we met, And I've been engaged in so many of those since that it seems like ancient history to think of a time when I wasn't involved in the activity. My book talks a lot about the AAUP. I don't talk about it here because there's a great deal about it in the book, because the AAUP has gradually turned into an anti-Zionist organization, which is one of the painful things in my life. There are a number of groups that I worked hard for that since I've left, they have become something very different and become hostile to Israel. It's one of the fruits, if you will, of long-term involvement. The book I'm talking about today, Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, was completed in July 2023, just a few months before what amounts to a radical fissure in our understanding of the world was opened up on October 7th. The time differences between Israel and the US, 7 hours in the East, 10 hours in the West, only a few hours for London, meant that in the US, we woke to early news reports of what had been ongoing for hours in the kibbutzim, the towns, on the roads, and in the fields along the border with Gaza. The slaughter of families that was so terrible, it should have woken us in the night, for most of us did not. Instead, we woke to hear the news. All of us knew even then that despite the indescribable horror, a substantial part of the international community within days would find reason to blame Israel for everything. We knew that in part because we knew that Israel would rapidly have to launch a military response to the Hamas assault. There'd be no choice. And the unsettling, unfamiliar reality that the response this time would have to begin on Israel's own territory, for the Hamas murder squads at that point, late in the day on the 7th, were still at work. What we did not expect was that a fresh wave of anti-Zionism, now thoroughly fused with anti-Semitism, would sweep over us within hours, not days. Days was the guess, in an uncanny echo of Israel's intelligence failures about Hamas's capacities and planning. Those of us outside the immediate zone of combat had our own failure of imagination and understanding. We had not understood the depth and spread of anti-Semitism in our midst. In colleges across the country, hatred amongst anti-Zionist faculty colleagues and students was brewing in wait for a passionate release. There is no other explanation for the rapidity with which eliminationist hostility coalesced on the left. It filled what I would call the anti-Zionist soundscape. We heard echoes of it from all directions before it had a chance to develop politically or intellectually. In retrospect, it would seem as if we woke to the first and second waves of horror. The first, the wave of horror from Israel. The second, the wave of horror from the international left simultaneously. The horror at what Hamas was doing, and the horror at its ecstatic endorsement by Hamas's allies. There was barely time to grieve or process the Hamas pogrom before the campus wars were underway. And yet, at that point, we could not glimpse the possibility of Hamas solidarity campus encampments spreading across the US and somewhat later into Britain and Europe. When we imagine the scenarios for the rest of 2024, we are really only guessing in the dark. We really do not know what awaits us around the next corner. And yet I expect virtually everyone in this audience knows that we cannot await events passively, that we must marshal resources and initiate actions now. And yet, a generation ago, I remarked that the defining feature of faculty identity that had dominated the academy for decades, arrogance, had increasingly been replaced by fear. Fear was by then a generation ago in faculty bones. In the wake of everything that has happened since 10/7, there is unquestionably new realization that wishful thinking and denial are neither winning nor even tolerable strategies. Campus anti-Semitism cannot be allowed to fester as we train the next generation of leaders and professionals. And yet, along with belatedly awakened faculty courage, there is intensified fear of reprisals for openly expressed Zionism, fear of social isolation, and overt ostracization for those unwilling to condemn Israel. The fear bubbles up in students, staff, and faculty. It is something each of us must confront and face individually, though we can help combat it by creating group solidarity. When I was completing this book, I had continuing doubts about whether even sympathetic readers would consider, let alone endorse, some of the strategies I proposed for countering faculty anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. Perhaps the dramatically increased threats we have faced since 10/7 will persuade some people to consider adopting positions that they would have rejected less than a year ago. So let me encapsulate and summarize some of the issues and options covered in the book in much more detail. I'll number 5 of them in sequence, 5 topics among those the book considers. 1, the first, defining academic freedom. At the core of the book and of any strategy for responding to faculty anti-Semitism must be a restoration of the founding definition of academic freedom. We don't need a new definition of academic freedom. We need to discredit the false understandings that have gained power and influence over the last 2 generations. Conservative critics of the academy have long complained that faculty members champion the rights and protections academic freedom grants them while ignoring the responsibilities it assigns. While that is true, it sidesteps the definition of academic freedom the AAUP articulated in its founding declaration of 1915. I claim no responsibility for that text. Though it is clear that academic freedom there in that text, it is clear that academic freedom was created primarily as a social good to protect the collective search for the truth. Individual faculty are protected so that their teaching and research can contribute to the search for the truth. Unconventional and dissenting views are protected because they may be recognized as persuasive in time. The search for the truth requires us to condemn falsehood and correct error. Academic freedom does not spread a kind of protective blanket over misguided assertions and conclusions. It requires debate and dispute as part of the search for the truth. If we think that Zionism is not a racist set of beliefs, then we need to combat it. If we think that equation is untrue, we need to dispute it with all our hearts. The increasingly common nonsense from the anti-Zionist camp maintains that critique suppresses their academic freedom anytime their opponents fault their history and their contemporary political beliefs. So I want to emphasize, in fact, that kind of debate is one of the responsibilities that academic freedom encompasses and guarantees. One principle I support throughout the book is that academic freedom protects your right to say whatever you want, but it does not, in fact, protect you from professional consequences for doing so. You have the right to propose a research project proving that Blacks are inferior to white people, or that Jews conspire to control the world's economy. Propose it if you want, but your colleagues can decide those are patently false, nonsensical hypotheses, vicious hypotheses, and simply deny your request for support. Some claims do not contribute to the search for the truth. It can take decades for that conviction to reach full multidisciplinary consensus, but at some point it did, though rogue disciplines now can be outliers. And there's an increasing tendency for anti-Zionist faculty to complain that when they come up for tenure, their work should not be criticized for its anti-Zionism because academic freedom protects it. It does not protect falsehoods. Point two, this may actually be the worst problem. Point two, what constitutes disciplinary truth? Our reliance on academic disciplines as arbiters of what counts as true must no longer be doctrinal. As recently as Finken and Post's 2009 book For the Common Good, a book about academic freedom by two highly regarded long-term members of the AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure, followed by Post's 2012 book, Democracy, Expertise, Academic Freedom, the disciplinary commitment to advance the sum of human knowledge seemed unshakable. Finken and Post grounded their confidence in what they believed was a, quote, commitment to the virtues of reason, fairness, and accuracy. Such values formed the framework of accepted professional norms that distinguish research that contributes from knowledge from research that doesn't contribute to knowledge. They quote fellow Committee A member Joan Scott's unwarranted confidence that, quote, disciplinary communities protect a place for criticism and critical transformation at the very heart of a conception of a discipline. And former Committee A member, Berkeley historian David Hollinger's idealized assurance that, quote, any particular disciplinary community exists what we might see as a series of concentric circles of accountability. Good luck. Finken and Post trace their understanding back to John Dewey's observation that indoctrination consists in dogmatically promulgating, quote, as truth, ideas or opinions that a discipline does not regard as dogmatically true, end quote. So Finken and Post phrase their admonition accordingly. Faculty should not, quote, impose a truth of a matter as to which there is dispute within the discipline. Okay, a standard that no longer deals with the absence of dispute that surrounds the dubious truths some disciplines now promote. Hollinger argues that we should judge a department's reliability in terms of the fidelity of the department to the broad contours of the learned discipline it is charged with representing on a given campus. So we judge the reliability of women's studies according to which it echoes the truths that the discipline of women's studies embraces as a whole. We judge the reliability of Middle East studies according to whether it embodies what the discipline as a whole believes in true. As true, this doesn't work anymore. Finken and Post give a concluding admonition, quote, academic freedom obliges scholars to use disciplinary standards, not political standards, to guide their teaching. So I'm a great admirer of both Finken and Post. I like both of them. I worked with them on Committee A for many years. Finken is a colleague of mine here, but their book no longer applies to the world we live in this respect, to its advice about academic disciplines. So, because they don't give any serious consideration to those disciplines whose standards have themselves become increasingly political. we now have a series of disciplines that consider the claim that Zionism is racism to be an established truth. At least since 10/7, that such disciplines routinely claim Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza, another lie. What disciplines are thus almost entirely immune to reason, oblivious to evidence where Israel is concerned? African American studies, anthropology, gender and women's studies, Middle East studies, and others. They have become what I would call indoctrination machines. The dissident faculty members within their ranks need a kind of Endangered Species Act to protect them. What I propose is that the departments representing these disciplines need to have their independent rights to hire and grant tenure and admit graduate students taken away from them. The ordinary review processes we have now are weak and inadequate. So what I recommend will require faculty senate involvement and long-term multidisciplinary insight. This will be immensely difficult, but keep in mind that many STEM fields already review those programs on their own campus and nationally with undisguised contempt. They don't think those are really academic disciplines. They think they're jokes. They just don't do anything about it. Okay. Point 3, personnel decisions. Briefly, there are a few key moments in careers when the beliefs and values faculty members espouse, the cultural and political convictions that guide their teaching and research, their exercise of academic freedom, can have consequences. If a faculty member cannot tell the difference between evidence and unsupported opinion, if he or she cannot provide evidence to support their claims, if he or she is unwilling to discuss the published views of those with differing conclusions, they can and should face consequences. Put bluntly, you do not have to hire a racist or an anti-Semite. You do not have to grant one tenure. You do not have to renew such a person's contract. That doesn't mean anti-Zionists should never be tenured. Reasoned, evidence-based original work should be supported whether you agree with it or not. But garbage should not be enshrined just because it stinks of anti-Semitism. Of course, I would grant Judith Butler tenure. I would grant Rashid Khalidi at Columbia tenure. But I opposed tenuring Stephen Zelita here at Illinois. Again, based on whether their work is based on evidence and reason, even if it's flawed. Fifth, social media. The emerging consensus led by the AAUP puts faculty comments on the internet and faculty posts on social media platforms outside the reach of any and all professional evaluation. That means that any such statements are to be considered what's called extramural, unconnected to teaching, research, or university service. The AAUP wants to prohibit consideration of their content or impact at any point in a faculty member's career. This is the most radical effort in recent memory to conceive of academic freedom as a faculty right unencumbered by any social or professional responsibilities. There had been a strain of opinion amongst AAUP leaders that considered statements culminating in a faculty member's areas of expertise to be intramural within the corpus of professional views and responsibilities, no matter where they appeared, whether it was in a book or essay or on a website. The most prominent spokesmen for that position, which I support, were Finken and Post. I cite their co-authored book above, and it takes that position. But in 2015, the AAUP took the opposite stand. All social media posts are to be considered exclusively public domain statements, and the university and their colleagues can't consider them when evaluating anyone. It's taken a long time for the academic community to absorb this news. It was first contained in a report on a tenure case, but in the last few years, it has been included in procedures for hiring and tenure committees. That means when you hire a faculty member who is active in extremist groups on social media, but never takes such extreme positions in academic journals or in a classroom, you have to ignore the social media activity. If a faculty member builds a public reputation for his or for her anti-Semitic social media activity, according to the AUP, it must be considered protective activity within the university. The faculty member will be held harmless when being considered for a job, when being considered for tenure and promotion, or when being renewed for a term contract. That means a faculty member who moderates his or her opinions in faculty essays and on campus, but offers them in what amounts to a spectrum of continuous racist or anti-Semitic reviews, can only be evaluated in terms of the officially permissible text. The wholly unacceptable antisocial character of the faculty member's views or the candidate's views may be clear when all the evidence is considered, but according to the AEUP, a responsible committee can't consider it. It must ignore everything extramural. As I argue in my book in much greater detail, a faculty member could create what amounts to an alternative social media persona expressing views that contradict a universal academic consensus, indeed a truth accepted by most of the world. The campus can have a lunatic on board, but consider him beyond reproach if he limits his lunacy to his iPhone. A faculty Holocaust denier who limits his denial to Facebook would be protected, even if he or she is a European historian for whom Holocaust denial would ordinarily make him unfit for a job in a history department. Instead of protecting academic freedom, the AAUP's policy position will eventually discredit it. Imagine what any normal person outside the faculty administration bubble would think if you told them. As far as we are concerned, our virulently racist faculty member, Joe Smith, who's racist on Facebook and Telegram, who says Black people are inferior, should be considered an entirely different person from the Joe Smith who's actually at our university. Now, of course, they both have the same home address and the same social security number, but we are treating them as two people, two different people, so we can preserve academic freedom. I don't believe academic freedom can survive this irrational nonsense. So briefly, because it looks like I'm about out of time. The fifth argument is about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And I talk about it at length in the book. I document the debates about it, and I make it clear that the 11 examples that follow the initial definition really can be used to help determine, first of all, the anti-Semitic character of statements on social media and on campus and so forth. And there's a lot of faculty research, group research, now using the IRA definition as an initial classification model for dealing with anti-Semitic statements. It's not an automatic system. You still have to discuss them. You have to think about them. You have to put them in context. But it's really a first critical step. And it is tremendously useful to lend some coherence and some intelligibility to the diverse phenomenon of contemporary anti-Semitic statements. I don't want it used on campus as a quasi-legal definition. I don't want it used in disciplinary proceedings, but as an educational tool in helping students understand what they're confront, it's tremendously valuable. And I offer a policy statement in the book that universities can use to specify how the IRA definition will be used and how it should not be used. And I think that hopefully, if people will take it seriously, will help undermine the false statements and false warnings about IRA that still proliferate throughout the world. Fear dominates many faculty members' lives, but I think if we adopt these strategies, we can help build solidarity and help make many more faculty members able to become activists in support of the right of the Jewish people to have a homeland in their ancient land. Thank you. That's it.
Yep. Thank you, Cary. I think there's a lot of material there actually that people might want to talk through and question and engage with, really. So please feel free to indicate and to ask. Much happier if you come on camera and ask your question, but there will also undoubtedly be some questions in the chat too. Well, maybe I will take the opportunity to engage a little bit. But first we have a question in the chat which says, how can we put Professor Nelson's ideas onto a larger stage and into action? For example, US congressional hearings. Cary, how did you see those congressional hearings to relate to the issue of academic freedom?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have a lot of confidence in what happens in Washington, D.C. And I think the hearings that we've seen with university leaders over the last couple of months have frequently been tremendously opportunistic. That is, politicians ask questions to promote their own careers, to get newspaper headlines of their own. It's not a great forum for subtlety and nuance. Nonetheless, they've asked some questions that are relevant. The challenges they gave to the first group of university leaders were fair challenges, opportunistic or not. And I've written about how people might have responded when Elise Stefanik, not one of my favorite people, said, our calls for the genocide of the Jews, violations of your code of conduct, and all the university presidents having been trained by their moronic lawyers to say, well, it depends on context. They couldn't just answer yes. They displayed inadequate leadership. They could have said, yes, they violate our codes of conduct. Then we have to decide what we're going to do about it. And there's a difference between a faculty member standing up in a rally and calling for the genocide of Jews or supporting Hamas, and someone doing it in his dorm room talking with two other students. So we do it, what's warranted in terms of a response from the administration really would depend upon the individual case. But the fundamental fact that a call for the murder of Jews violates our code of conduct is absolutely without question. The answer wouldn't have been difficult, but they couldn't give it. I've thought about testifying in Congress. It depends, frankly, on whether there's a given congressperson on a subcommittee who thinks he or she wants to hear what you have to say. You're invited if they think they agree with you, and if they think their own position can be enhanced by what you say. Is there anyone there who would feel that way about me? I don't know, but the possibility obviously exists.
Leonid, please ask your question.
Hello, Professor Nelson. First of all, thanks for your presentation. Very interesting. If you had significant financial and human resources, what would you recommend doing to establish these academic freedoms, to achieve them in academia?
Well, I would look for really quite a number of things. First of all, faculty members have less resources to fight anti-Semitism and to fight university boycotts, and I'm talking about the US at least, than they did prior to 2019. The resources that we have available are much less than they were overall currently. So we're facing much more aggressive combats, and we have less money. So that if we had money, what would we do? First of all, we would make videos with concise versions of the issues at stake, concise redefinition of academic freedom, a warning about social media and how faculty members can misuse it and use it irresponsibly and maliciously, and get such videos out for public consumption. So we would try to reach an international audience with concise, compelling versions of these arguments, because academic books and essays, only reach a limited audience. Just you need to work in the media to be able to get this done. And I think we would want to hire really good PR firms, which are expensive, to promote these sometimes complex and nuanced ideas about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on campus. So videos, PR firms to help us out in our outreach to the media, to help us in our social media activity. We would want enough money to fund faculty chairs at universities, senior faculty positions for people who are sympathetic to the right of the Jews to a state in their national homeland. The awful fact about people donating for faculty positions in this area now is that you can donate the money and then Omar Barghouti is appointed to the chair. You have no assurance that if you're a Zionist contributor, the money can be used to support aggressive anti-Zionism. So I think we need some lawyers to help us devise donation principles that will enable people to have some reasonable restrictions on the political purpose to which their donations are given. So we need an organized effort across the country to help donors give money. Now, donors should not be able to pick who gets a faculty position. That violates academic freedom, and I'm completely opposed to donors having that power. Sometimes they get it in areas of business mainly. Business donors seem to get it. Why is that a surprise? Zionist donors don't get it. But you ought to be able to write a gift in such a way that it can't actually be used to undermine your core beliefs. So we need that, and we need the money to promote it across the country. We need more money for faculty travel to Israel. The single best thing you can do to affect the faculty members' beliefs, we know this from taking several hundred faculty members to Israel, is let them go there and see the place and talk to people, see what a diverse country it is. I could come up with some more things we could do with a lot of money, but I think I'm already spending a lot in answer to your question. So there's no question whatsoever that money could make a huge difference. I find that I have less now, and my colleagues have less now, as I said, than we did a few years ago.
Thank you.
Cary, Cynthia, your question, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this entire discussion today. I've been very active in the American Anthropological Association and also at the university where I teach at Rutgers University. And I have a couple of questions. One is that those universities that have managed to have a peaceful end to the encampments have very often been able to do this because there was a capitulation to the demands of the protesters. And this was certainly true at Rutgers. I find this very concerning. The Jewish community had been asking for many things. Their requests were never granted. We've now been told there'll be a Middle East Studies department. No mention at all that Jews or Israelis will be included, Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. I'm not adverse to that, but we need to have a diverse center. The next thing is that the hearings that somebody mentioned have really become used in such a way that it seems to bolster Donald Trump, because the most active voices tend to be Republicans. So this is very concerning. And you see a certain proportion of Jewish voters who are saying, well, now we have to vote for Trump. So I was wondering if you could respond to both of those things.
Yeah, well, I won't be voting for Trump. If you want that on the table, you can have it. I really can't be sure that I'll stay out of prison if he gets in office.
No, I'm not advocating that.
But you raise a series of really great topics, in part by talking about the encampments. Look, obviously, I grew up in the anti-Vietnam generation and was active not in campus protests, because I was at an undergraduate college that was thoroughly anti-war. I don't think there was a single person anywhere in sight who wasn't against the war. We never demonstrated on campus. The campus was like, an anti-war center, but we did a lot of demonstrating in the country, and I participated in demonstrations. I was wrestled to the ground by a Secret Service agent when I was amongst the small group of students who interrupted Lyndon Johnson, and I've been arrested briefly, so I've been through all of that. I will say this about the current encampments, because it's something we certainly didn't face then, and something we have never faced before, at least in the US and Canada, which is that there was an organized effort to encourage students to resist the police physically. When I was arrested, the rule was you thank the officers, you cooperate with them, you go to jail. That's why you demonstrated. That's why you committed civil disobedience. Go on record in going to jail. And the police were actually very nice, because we were totally cooperated. We went along with it. But, on my own campus and on many campuses across the country, the protesters at the encampments received a booklet giving them instructions on how to physically resist the police. And people we're about 2.5 hours south of Chicago. Some folks came down from Chicago to teach the protesters on the encampment how to resist the police. So what they really wanted, what they were being encouraged to do, was create a major physical conflict with the police. It happened just for a moment here. Two protesters were arrested. Both of them happened to be non-students. And then the university, which usually makes the wrong decision no matter what it was on the table, they have a remarkable record of bad judgment, which goes back at least 50 years. This time they thought maybe a physical battle on the center of campus wouldn't be such a good idea. And the governor warned them of that, so they withdrew. In the end, the encampment just disappeared. By tolerating it, they didn't have to make any concessions like many campuses have. It just disappeared. So concessions, historically, boards of trustees or other governing groups do not let students dictate what investments they will make. Students don't get to make an argument about divestment and get heard before the board. They can make it, but the board isn't hearing them. So it's conceivable that a board of trustees or a trust could make a statement that students and faculty who wish to comment on any investments can do so, not offering them a hearing, not offering them a voice before the board, but they can make a statement about investment, which we will think about. To isolate Israel as the only topic about which students or faculty can approach a board of trustees is wholly anti-Semitic. In other words, it's like every other case in which Israel is singled out as a country meriting special attention that no other country gets for the same issues. It's a specific violation of one of Ira's 11 examples. So I think it would have been much better to just tolerate the encampments nonviolently and letting the students eventually tire of them, as happened on my own campus. I think concessions are a bad idea. Now, my guess is that the students will not win the day. Although there is one campus in the United States, Sonoma State University, where the president actually announced that they would end investments in Israel. They would no longer establish any academic relationships with Israeli universities. And he had to step down as president almost immediately thereafter. That's the only college that's made that despicable decision. But on the other hand, he didn't last very long. And so at least it sent a message that you cannot do that. It was probably inevitable that some president would fail to stand up to the principles and allow and actually make that completely disastrous anti-Semitic concession, but at least he's out the door. Well, I mean, that answers a few of your issues. Another issues among them that you want me to say, maybe comment on? Are you okay?
I'm okay. I think I'll give someone else a chance. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks
Thanks,
for
Cynthia.
raising those topics.
I'm going to turn to Yaron. Hi, Yaron. Your question, please.
Thank you. In the beginning of your talk, you referred kind of wholesale to anti-Zionism as the problem that kind of infringes on or claims academic freedom and maybe shouldn't. So I've got two questions. I was wondering, first of all, is there a spectrum? Can you give us an idea of, in your opinion, is there, what on the anti-Zionist spectrum would still deserve to fall under academic freedom and be protected? And what, on the other hand, would not? Obviously, incitement for violence and so on, I think we all agree, but what would be the kind of political stance where you would feel that, that's a transgression and should not be protected under academic freedom? And the second question, intrinsically related to that, how do we trust universities to implement and to have a sound and solid judgment about that spectrum? Let's assume once we hear from you, we accept, we agree on that spectrum of what it is. Let's kind of assume that. What university managements can we really trust to implement? I just want to give a short example. I worked at a UK university for many, many years, and 25 years I was professor there in linguistics. And at some point I had an argument with a colleague about language policy, something which is quite innocent in Britain. There's no violence around it, and there is racism, but not. And there was a position articulated by a few colleagues that after Brexit, the government's language policy should be geared to creating a global Britain competing with the EU. Civil servants have to learn languages so that they can be good spies, and so on and so forth. And I critique that, and my position was we need a domestic language policy because we're a multilingual society. I was told to shut up in as rude terms as you can imagine by management, because I'm competing, and that wasn't, to me, an assault on academic freedom. I was then invited to a conference in Moscow, And I talked about the topic. This was 2017, and I said, what I tell you today, I can't say in Britain. So I wouldn't trust universities I wouldn't hand them over that kind of thing if they can't decide, that the critique of language policy is harmless, and they somehow get themselves convinced into saying it harms our reputation. Or specifically, the case of Joseph Massad, I think, is well known in Colombia. That's been kind of controversial, and he's always been kind of very careful to stay within sort of verbal limits. There's no case that seems to be straightforward.
Well, I mean, in a way, there are a few cases that are straightforward. I mean, you mentioned Joseph Massad, whom I've written about more than once. His work does not meet my standards of faculty competence. I mean, it really doesn't. So I would have had a problem giving Joseph Massad tenure. And of course, one thing that's happened with a number of anti-Zionist faculty members is that they've crossed a line in the wake of 10/7. So Joseph Massad is now an enthusiastic endorser of what Hamas did on 10/7. I mean, he wrote an article which he published the day after he published it on 10/8 that extols what Hamas did. And I've published a piece talking about that and using him as an example of someone who went too far. But he has tenure. I wouldn't take away his tenure, but I would start wondering whether the universities should support his research, whether it should give him sabbaticals, whether it should give him salary raises. In other words, I could see some sanctions short of termination for Joseph Massad, given he's supporting mass murder now. I mean, I'm not sure what you can do that's worse. I mean, he hasn't come out with a statement supporting cannibalism, so I suppose he still has somewhere to go in violating human standards of behavior. But, he's gone about as far as you can in the contemporary world in endorsing Hamas. I would review his efforts for support seriously. I would give some serious thought about whether he could teach his course on Israel-Palestine any longer. In my book, Israel Denial, I talk about his course in detail because a Columbia student sent me the syllabus. And so I go through the syllabus week by week and talk about what Massad was doing. And then I can't know what he said in class, but many of the extreme texts that he teaches, he's also commented about in his scholarship. So if I find out what he says about a book in an essay, and then I want to know what he says about it in class, I believe I've got a point of connection. I believe that, he's unlikely to suppress what he's already said in print when he teaches that book. So I had a lot of evidence to put together. He also, of course, had a very thorough investigation of his teaching based on anti-Semitic accusations. I think in the report on that, his teaching came out in 2005. And it didn't take any action against him, but it said, we believe, he denied these things ever happened. But the faculty committee that wrote the report said, we think it is likely these things did happen, contrary to what Massad says. So in the wake of 2007, you saw people on the internet saying Joseph Massad has never had complaints about his teaching. Well, the report is still online, right? So the evidence that he has is considerable. So I'm sorry to go on so long about Uncle Joe, but it happens to be one of my obsessions. So I guess it was irresistible. Now, the spectrum of anti-Zionist views. Do I trust the university to adjudicate them? Hell no. I mean, at best, one wants to see faculty committees that have had a lot of education about anti-Semitism, that aren't just appointed because of their status, but appointed because they really know something about the subject and demonstrate that knowledge, thinking through these problems. I don't really trust the administration to do anything. Now, I come from a major research university, one of the major research universities in the country, which when I was president of AAUP, I got to know a lot of other college presidents. And one of the comments that I got more than once was that my campus gets the worst legal advice of any research university in the country. And I felt that that was pretty accurate. So do I trust universities to make these decisions? Any university but mine, that would be a start, which I think there are probably some other people who would make that the same point of start for themselves. So spectrum of anti-Zionist positions. Partly it really depends upon in what ways are the anti-Zionist positions articulated. So for a publication, I'm looking for arguments that are supported by evidence, real evidence that I can believe in, not simply personal opinion. I'm not looking for publications for whom the support is citing other people who believe and say exactly the same thing without citing evidence themselves. In other words, a simple echo chamber of confirmed and of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is not evidence. And I'm looking for evidence that people are willing to have a debate with people who have different opinions. So I want to see an anti-Zionist faculty publication engaged with Zionist opinion in a responsible way. And that's why there's some anti-Zionists who I think, even though I disagree with them, they operate in a responsible manner, and I would support their work. And there are others that I think really can't tell the difference between an opinion and evidence. That was my problem with Stephen Salaita, that he considered other people's opinions to be evidence. And if they don't cite evidence, I'm sorry, that's not evidence. That's not really. And he wouldn't have a conversation in his work with people with different opinions. So all those things that I was looking for, he didn't have. So I'm less concerned in faculty evaluation about the exact character of anti-Zionist opinion than whether it builds in the procedures of academic argument. So that's really brief, but still I think you can see what I'm focused on. It's not whether you believe this or that, it's how you operate within your belief system. Now, I think the first step for universities in response to the opinions voiced in the demonstrations, which included faculty opinions, of course, is to respond in detail, acknowledging the anti-Semitic consequences of statements that are made at the demonstrations, the slogans that people offer. In other words, you have to do something. If you're going to let the demonstration stand and eventually wear itself out, and people go home for their summer jobs or whatever they're going to do, if you're going to decide not to have a confrontation, but simply let it die of its own accord, you have to do something to protect the students who are being subjected to chants that make them feel physically threatened. The first thing you have to do is stop what I consider to be just an intellectually bankrupt way of thinking about the demonstrations on a given campus. Because the administrators on my campus like to say, we were fine, there was no violence. And so our students were not threatened. Well, the students have the internet available to them. The students have the news media available to them. Their psychological condition is influenced by international discourse, not just by the campus. And the international effects and forces are filtered through the things that people say on campus. So from the river to the sea will be free is a statement that whose effects are shaped by international political uses, not by the beliefs of the particular people on campus. And you have to castigate anti-Semitic discourse to show some solidarity with the students and faculty who feel overwhelmingly threatened by it, and often they did, and they felt threatened whether or not there was violence on their own campus. So those are demonstrably anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist slogans that need to be confronted and condemned by an administration. That means academic freedom lets you allow them to happen, but you establish a setting in which they are condemned. And I think you also have to think long term. So there's some anti-Semitic statements or anti-Zionist statements for which you should have a long-term educational response. You need to know that courses will be available to help train people about anti-Semitism. You need to have required anti-Semitism training for all faculty and all staff members. I'm not going to say for all students in an elaborate way, but faculty and staff have to go through regular training programs about anti-Semitism. So I think, and it's not just true of anti-Semitism, you have to respond to hate speech in a way that tries to limit its effects long term. You can't just have a single event and think, well, okay, this was nasty stuff. We'll have something from the other perspective and we'll solve the problem. Well, I'm afraid not. Anti-Semitic speech roots those beliefs in people, and you need a long-term struggle, a long-term campus-wide struggle to combat it. Your basic question, the spectrum of beliefs, I think I'd set it aside when I'm evaluating faculty publications and look at those other issues in detail. But I'm also willing to think, what has the person said before? The student represents a group. I mean, Students for Justice in Palestine offers a single anti-Semitic chant. If so, it's part of months and months and years of history is doing that. The IRA definition tells us to look at context. Well, the context for Jewish Voice for Peace and for Students for Justice in Palestine is an anti-Semitic context. And that helps demonstrate to you that their particular utterance yesterday constitutes anti-Semitism, because you know the whole history of where they've been coming from. So some statements need really to be evaluated by a sense of that past practice. Thanks.
Do you want to Yaron quickly?
No, I just want to say thank you. And I just,
Yeah.
ironically, that's what the president said in Congress, didn't they? They said it's all about context, and and they they didn't really survive that. But no, I understand what you mean. Thank you.
I could answer it in a way that you would survive. I mean, the answer I gave was, yes, those things violate our standards, but what you do about it depends upon how it happened, when it happened, where it happened. So that's, rather than just referring to context, give them a couple examples. Here's a case where I might think of getting rid of a faculty member, or I think we would discuss and have due process about a faculty member surviving in his or her position. And here's a case where I would tell a student, if you want to stay at Columbia, you've got to take this course on the history of anti-Semitism. Your punishment is that you get to sit in a classroom for a semester. That's your sanction.
Cary, who's going to teach Joseph Mossad about anti-Semitism?
No one can teach Joseph Mossad. I mean, he can't teach.
Right.
Well, I tried 20 years ago, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. It falls under confidence of my confidentiality, sorry, my previous employer. But I'll just give you a hint. 20 years ago, I tried, and we didn't get anywhere, I have to say.
We had a course on my own campus about anti-Semitism. It's no longer taught because fate intervened in a decisive way, and biology intervened. But several students over the years who took the course said, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a course about anti-Semitism. It's a course that teaches you how to be an anti-Semite. So build as a course.
There is an issue. There's an issue about the distinction between training and teaching and education. Like, I'm always worried about training, because to do training, somebody has to want to train, right? Somebody has to want to be trained, or which is not the same thing at all as teaching or education.
Well, I think you're right that a resistant person who goes through the training may not gain much from it. Can you assign a student to take a course which you know is a good course? The student has been mouthing anti-Semitic remarks on campus. and you tell him if you wish to stay, you have to sit through this course. There's a good chance, if it's a whole semester and it's a good course, that it may have some impact on that student. Teaching my anti-Semitic colleagues anything, that's a hard road. And I'm not going to guarantee success there. I mean, I've given a lot of talks about BDS and anti-Semitism, where at the very back of the auditorium are half a dozen faculty members who do nothing but scowl for the entire hour and a half and who are never willing to ask a question. And of course, they're BDS advocates who aren't going to hear anything on a particular day. That's a problem I can't solve.
I would like to turn to Tanya Aman. Aman for
Aman, yeah.
Aman for her question, please.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I don't know, maybe my question addresses the relationship between academic freedom and research ethics, and I'm asked myself, so on a practical level, should the guidelines you were talking about be implemented in a university commission being responsible for research ethics? And if so, how and where? And maybe when as well.
Yeah, I assume, I mean, did you mean the IRA guidelines?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think yes, it's a really good idea to put them in the statement of how research awards will be granted and the statement of the principles that may guide the granting of research awards. But I think what that means is you do a detailed analysis of the research proposal and see if it deals with these issues in a responsible, thoughtful, evidence-based way. I mean, I actually haven't written anything about the question that you've asked me, but now I think it's a great question that I should write something about. So I'll think about it more. It's really a good challenge. But my initial instinct is, so long as the committee is doing detailed evaluations of a research proposal, the IRA guidelines would be a good set of principles to embody in a university's research agenda. It's, one of the things I do in the book is talk about all of the projects that are now being positively guided by the IRA guidelines. They're being used by a number of ambitious collaborative research projects to think about social media. They're guiding an increasing amount of work. So I think we're going to have, we have, and we will have increasingly more examples of how the IRA guidelines can actually facilitate good research. They don't inhibit it. They actually make it more coherent. So I think that can be brought into context if you use the IRA guidelines.
Thanks, Cary. Can I ask you, just give you a kind of hypothetical to tease out the distinction really between freedom of speech and academic freedom and freedom of speech on social media and academic freedom in your scholarly work? Let me ask a hypothetical. If a physics professor, right, anyone's allowed to go into the public square and declare that the Earth is flat, right? That the Earth is not round, the Earth is flat. That's obviously a matter of free speech. What happens if a physics professor goes into the public square and declares that the Earth is flat? Or what happens if she goes into social media and keeps tweeting about the flatness of the Earth? And what happens if she teaches in her lectures that the Earth is flat? What is the distinction there?
Well, the AAUP has had for many, many years, decades actually, a criteria which they put in one word, a phrase, fitness to teach. That is, are you fit to teach your subject matter? So if let's say a geologist, let's make it worse than a physicist, okay? A geologist who deals with the physical earth. If a geologist says the earth is flat, by the AEUP standards, and if, God help, this geologist says the same thing in class, he's not fit to teach the subject. I mean, he has in that case, he's not dealing with a disciplinary consensus. He's dealing with a consensus across all scientific and all humanistic fields. In other words, in that case, you do have a lunatic, and that person can get reviewed by the faculty, but he or she ain't going to last. The disciplinary standard doesn't necessarily work, because there are disciplines so corrupted by politics that they, as a standard, as I said in my presentation, offer us only bias. They don't offer us consensus that's based on reason. But I think, and I would say the same thing about a historian who says the Holocaust didn't happen. That's not a fact-based statement. And if he or she teaches that in class, or if they're a European historian, whether they teach it or not, they're not fit to teach. I mean, so fitness has been the AEUP standard. And for some of these cases, it gives you a pretty sound basis on which to decide a faculty member's future.
So you're a geologist who teaches very good stuff about the shape of the Earth in their class, but if they are at the same time tweeting, endlessly about the Earth being in fact flat, what's the AAUP argument then that his belief that the Earth is flat should not be taken into account when he's being assessed as a geologist?
Yeah, well, the AAUP is, I think, so detached from reality on this matter that I really have trouble even expressing how delusional this is. The AEUP's position is very simple. In class, the geologist says the Earth is round. On Facebook, he or she says it's flat. The AEUP's position is all of those statements on Facebook are extramural. They're public speech, and they are protected by academic freedom in an absolute sense. There's nothing you can say on social media in and of itself which would disqualify you from a university position.
But isn't it the opposite,
let me
Cary?
give an example. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education by a friend of mine, as it happens, a couple of years ago. He supports the AEU position, and he says that means if you indulge in racist ravings, social media, irrational, poisonous, racist ravings on social media, but you don't do it on campus, and you don't do it in your academic books and essays, you're protected from any sanctions. In that case, I don't think you're protected from sanctions. I think that the university has to ask itself, if you're coming up for tenure, I say you're out. The university has a right to say, the public impact of this faculty member's work is so poisonous to our reputation and to the reputation of the academy that we don't want him here permanently. Now, it would be a different problem and a really messy one if a tenured faculty member does that, right? What do you do to a tenured faculty member if it's not in his or her field? Let's say the geologist is okay on campus, but online, he or she engages on vile anti-racist ravings. The AEP says the university should say nothing about that whatsoever. Not only
it's the wrong way around, Cary, isn't it? That academic freedom is supposed to be within the discipline, but freedom of speech in the public square is not protected by academic freedom. It's protected by, well, in America, the First Amendment. So you're kind of statements in the public square that are nothing to do with the disciplinary framework, how can they be protected by academic freedom?
Well, mind you, all the First Amendment does is prohibit government sanctions for speech. It does not in any sense. Let's say you're working for IBM and you behave that way online. IBM can fire you the next day. IBM doesn't need to give you due process. All IBM has to say is you're discrediting this business by your behavior. Please turn in your keys. I mean, so
That's what UK universities are like. Sorry to interrupt, but UK universities work like businesses. There's no such thing as tenure. And they've been firing people left and right and center just for sending a tweet claiming that it puts the university into disrepute. And those decisions are kind of ad hoc. And that's why my question before, how do you trust them to make solid decisions on?
Well, I don't trust the university administrators. And what I say in the book is if social media is at issue, then it's at issue when a person has a persistent pattern of making such comments on social media over time, over a year or over more. In other words, I think, and I say this about Americans in the book, I don't say it about anyone who's British. I say that, a faculty member sending out a tweet has just as much right to be an idiot as any other American. And many will prove that they can exercise that right. So a university that simply responds to one or two irrational tweets is really exceeding what its authority should be. It should not be able to sanction someone for that. People can act out, and people can lose their emotional control and say something on social media that they regret or that it is atypical. In the book, I only deal with people who have really an extended history of putting anti-Semitic comments online. And then I think you have to deal with their social presence as part of their professional profile. But a particular venting, I don't think so.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a point? Because I think we're coming to the end of our time. One of the things we see in Britain actually is that if there's a question of anti-Semitism, for example, from an academic, one of the things the universities will do is, or if a student makes a complaint, this academic was anti-Semitic, then one of the things that happens is that the university will employ a barrister or a top lawyer to go and write a report, and the barrister will come back and the barrister will say, well, there's no unlawful speech here, and then the university will say there's no unlawful speech, and that'll be the end of the matter. But of course the question wasn't whether there was unlawful speech, the question was whether there was speech that was inappropriate within a discipline or inappropriate within a community of scholarship.
By the way, I say in the book, my guess is that in the US, Miller would have kept his job, that he probably would have lost his position in the US. Doesn't make that the right decision. It's just my guess is because I think the First Amendment has a lot of impact, a powerful impact on what speech universities will act in relationship to. And
well, that was what the judge said in the end.
Very strong, but I think he might have survived here.
That was what the judge said in the end in Britain, although
talking about the differences. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That was the determination of the judge in the end in Britain, although the judge did say that he would have been sacked a few weeks later lawfully. I want to come to a couple of final questions from Ephraim and Paulina. Do you want to ask a question too? Ephraim, will you ask your question succinctly?
Yes,
And
I
if
just
Paulina wants
wanted
to
to
ask,
say, I think we are focusing on the Anglosphere, but in Italy, the University of Turin capitulated to the rioters, the Senate of the university, and now a class of second graders aged 7 were taken to the rioters on the premises and taught how to sing their songs and slogans and carry a Palestinian flag. That is where it gets. In London, there are teachers who were radicalized at university and are teaching children in secondary education that much.
Well, I
That was
think
Biden, was it?
Yes, there have been, for example, papers since 2017 about what is happening at schools in England.
Cary, let me call Ephraim, and then you can answer the two together. And I think we are running out of time. So, Ephraim, what's your question?
Yes, my question is that, is it true, in your opinion, that in this century, it has been the Anglosphere that has conducted all this wave of animosity? Because I think the other universities have just been emulating what Britain first and United States later have been doing.
Well, we've just seen the protests that got started here spread to Britain and Europe. So we have a rather incontrovertible case of the United States students and faculty initiating a new form of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and seeing it spread widely. I think it's not just over the fate of Israel that American faculty publication and research has huge influence. It has influence throughout the world. It's, the sheer size of the American Academy, the sheer number of professors. We have 3,500 colleges and universities in the United States. I can't name them all, but that's the number I'm told. And I think their impact is indeed quite wide. So you asked in part about the influence of Britain. For better or worse, the influence of the United States is much wider on these matters because the numbers are so much greater. Now, in the age of social media, influence can come from anywhere. I will say that there are some anti-Semitic groups on social media that actually originate from the United States. So the US has more responsibility for anti-Semitic social media activity than you would know from simply looking at the websites themselves. That is, there are groups that don't identify a physical location for themselves, but if you do the research, and people have, their physical location is here, from somewhere between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. So the American influence on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is stronger than you would guess from a casual tracing of the sources. Again, that is a lot more true simply in terms of quantity of the US than it is of Britain. I've never felt that Britain was, especially its upper classes, were really hospitable to Jews. I think that there's a lot of ingrained anti-Semitism, especially in Britain's, wealthy class. But I'm not sure how much public influence they have. The Anti-Zionist Academy in the US, I think, has worldwide influence. And then meanwhile, everybody and his brother and sister can get online and spread their convictions. Then there's the dark web, which we don't have time to talk about, but I talk about it a bit in my book, where the most vile anti-Semitism resides, and where you can go to see appalling videos and appalling arguments. So the internationalization of anti-Semitism is something that, is now a much more pervasive and powerful phenomenon than it had been even 5 or 6 years ago.
Thank you.
Cary, thank you very, very much for your really interesting talk and for your dealing with lots of questions and points. Just incidentally, we had questions from 2 people who've really recently written really interesting pieces that we have published. The first is Yaron, who wrote this piece about his experience in academia, and the second is Tanya Amon, who wrote this startling piece about the lack of response from the music world to what happened at the Nova Festival.
I'd like links to both of those, by the way, if you'll send them to me. Maybe other people will like those as well.
I've just put them in the chat, Cary. I will certainly send them to you too if you would like. In, I think, 2 weeks' time, on the 6th of June, we will be welcoming Dave Rich, who has a new version of his book, Everyday Hate, published, which has new sections about the post 7th of October world. People can get hold of Cary Nelson's book, about which he has been talking, I imagine from Amazon. Is there a place where there's a discount on it, Cary, or something like that?
There is if you were ordering from the publisher, but I'm not certain that they can. I'm not certain what the postage would be trying to get it to England. So I can give you that discount, but you might be better off just going to Blackwell's in London, in England, rather than getting it shipped from the United States. I know that ordinarily sending a paperback from the United States to London costs $40 for a single paperback.
So the book is published by, who's it published by?
Academic Studies Press, but it's available from Blackwell's.
Right. And it's called Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, and it's by Cary Nelson. I promised you the date that we've penciled in for our conference in 2025 in London, which will be, wait, let me find it on my calendar. We think 20th to the 23rd of April, so please make plans to be in London that week. Thank you very much, Cary, and this has been an event put on by the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Thank you very, very much to this community of people for being here.
David, I want to give you a special thanks for not only for holding this, but letting us do a really extended question and answer period, which I love doing. I mean, that's one of my favorite things. I love to give people a chance to say what they want and get a response, and almost no one lets me do that, or lets anyone. So
brilliant.
That's a distinction.
Well, I've seen webinars where you feel like you're watching TV, and we don't do that. We are all in a room together, I think, or I hope. So thank you very, very much, Cary and everybody. Thanks. Good evening.